Thanks, Kate, and thanks everybody for joining today. When I was asked to do this by Christina Anderson, basically what came to mind is helping people in positions like you all occupy access data that might help manage land and water resources more effectively. And really, what came to mind is the work that I helped Columbia County do in terms of accessing some of this data for their land and water management plan. So that's kind of the reason I thought this would be a good session. And I'm hoping that it'll be useful in terms of the work that you all do or the information that sometimes would be beneficial to decision-making process. So just briefly, I want to go through some basic overview of well water data and groundwater and why it's useful. Mainly, dispelling myths that groundwater is an underground lake or river. We all know that groundwater is just the water that occupies the empty space in the soil and the rock below our feet. And we use wells basically to pull water out of the ground into our homes. Those wells are also kind of the window into that groundwater resource. So the more data that we have from wells, the more accurately we'll be able to describe the groundwater resource where we live or throughout the state. So really, the more wells we have data for, the better or the more detailed picture we'll be able to paint of groundwater quality. One thing to keep in mind is that groundwater quality is oftentimes very local. So wells, even sometimes in very close proximity to one another, might have very different water quality. Again, the more data we have, the more detailed picture we'll be able to paint. But the problem is accessing that data and helping people understand where to go for that information is one of the main things I hope to do today. Just highlighting that, various things impact groundwater, groundwater storage, groundwater quality, and in Wisconsin's geology, which holds and stores our groundwater, is very different depending on where you are in Wisconsin. We have this layered cake geology, which means that not only does our geology vary spatially across the state, it also varies vertically throughout the state. So well depth is also important for determining water quality. If we think about water quality, again, water, we call it the universal solvent. So anything water comes in contact with, it has the ability to dissolve small amounts of those materials. So the impurities that we find in our groundwater is never just pure H2O. It's always going to have different impurities that depend on the types of rocks, minerals, land use where that water recharges. Even the types of plumbing and packaging that water is stored or transported in will sometimes impart different impurities. And then treatment sometimes might be necessary to take those impurities out. But the basic premise or idea here is that water quality is going to be quite different depending on where you live because of all those various factors. The rocks, the soils, the land use will all impart different characteristics to water. And then when it comes to data or what, access to data that we have, there's really two main types of wells that I'll be talking about today. One is public water supply systems, which are regularly tested and regulated by drinking water standards to varying degrees. Public water systems would include municipalities that provide water to residents of a city or a village, but it also includes things like bars, restaurants, churches that serve the public. Requirements for testing of public water supplies, depend on the types of classification. So wouldn't be, surprising to people that municipal water systems have stricter testing requirements than, let's say, a bar, a restaurant, or a church. But all of those public water supply systems are collecting valuable information that might be useful. And then we have private wells, which are probably the most abundant wells that occur or occupy Wisconsin's landscape, serving 1.7 million people and nearly 800,000 wells distributed across the state. That provides a lot of detail in terms of the spatial resolution of groundwater. Less ability than public water systems to talk about kind of the temporal resolution or changes to groundwater quality. But these private wells, most of you probably already know that they're not required to be regularly tested. There are some basic testing requirements when a well is constructed. Bacteria is one that has always been required. And as of 2014, nitrate is now required anytime a new well is constructed. So that nitrate requirement since 2014 has allowed us to collect a lot of additional data on nitrate. That's been extremely beneficial already and will continue to be. There's also some testing requirements as of 2014 that any new well, I should say any well that has well or pump work performed on it or a well inspection is now required to be tested for bacteria, nitrate, as well as arsenic. So again, since that date, there's been a lot of additional data that we're now able to access. So what I'd like to do now is do a quick demo of two tools that would provide access to this data. And I'm gonna just swap my screen here. So bear with me as I try to locate. And you should see a website for the Center for Watershed Science and Education, Wisconsin Well Water Viewer. So this is accessible online right now for anybody to view and access. And some of you may have already used this resource. What I'd like to do is just highlight some of the functionality, some of it which might be not readily apparent to people. So here it's asking you to enter, and what we're seeing initially is just a map showing the average nitrate concentration by county. And one thing that you'll notice is that on the left-hand side, there's a variety of different parameters. It also shows display by county. If we click display by township, we'll see that the resolution or the level of detail goes down, and we can even view this information at a section level. And you might notice as we've zoomed in, the level of detail or the level of coverage starts to diminish. And the reason for that is that in order to characterize a region, we need a minimum number of samples. So if we want to color code an area for a section, we need a minimum of 2 samples for that section, which in some parts of the state might be difficult just because there's not a lot of wells in those areas. In those areas, you'd see that if we went to the township level, some of those areas that were blank are now filled in, and that means that we have hit the minimum number required to characterize the township level detail. And that minimum level is 5. And at the county level, what you'd see is that most, if not all counties are filled in with respect to nitrate because they've hit that minimum threshold of I believe it's 25 samples in order to color code a county. You can toggle between any of these different parameters. So if you were interested in chloride, let's say, we could do all that same thing for chloride. And one thing you might notice is that the level of detail for chloride is somewhat less, even at this scale, than it would be for nitrate. And the reason being is that nitrate is a much more common test. So the information we have for nitrate is much more extensive than it is for chloride. Some of the other functionality that people might not be aware of is you can select different base maps. So if you go to the gallery and you wanted to look at the imagery, you could put the satellite photo as the surrounding or the backdrop for the imagery. And when you zoom in, if we wanted to zoom in and look at this information let's say at the section level, we could actually zoom in and do a transparency to see what's the underlying land use. So for something like nitrate, land use is the dominant factor, and soils and geology also play a part, but it's going to be the land use that's responsible for the nitrate. So this provides some ability to see what is the underlying land use responsible for the elevated nitrate values in the area. Another function that might not be readily apparent to people that have used this tool in the past would be the statistics tool. So if we wanted to get a sense for the information contained, we could do a search by county. So if we were interested in let's say Portage County, we could scroll down at Portage, and it would generate a table for what information is known on nitrate for Portage County. If you toggle between the different parameters, it would keep that same tabular format for Portage County. It would just change based on the respective parameter. We'll go back to nitrate. So for nitrate, it shows that there's almost 15,000 samples for Portage County. It breaks it down by the percentage in the different ranges. And for health-related standards, it would also give you the percent exceedance. So that is the percent of samples, private well water samples in Portage County that exceed that health standard. And these data basically are all the private well water data that's available for this tool. It's data that goes back 30 years. So it's good for painting a detailed picture. It's less useful for understanding those temporal, let's say, trends over time. Other ways that you could interact with this data is if, again, you went down to the section level and you observed that there's parts of Portage County that look to be or look to have higher levels of nitrate. You could actually zoom into those areas by simply creating a shape, and then that shape, it would basically grab the data from that area and allow you to see the breakdown, how many samples exist for that area, as well as the breakdown, and we'd see that in that area the percent exceedance is much higher than the county average of 20%. So these are all tools that might be hidden, but are available if you're looking to zoom in or understand a little bit better what water quality might be. There are also different boundary layers. So if you were interested in say a watershed, you're working on a watershed plan, you might be interested in summarizing that information by watershed. And that's also a possibility by using this text select and locate feature, where if you knew the watershed, and these are Huck 10 watersheds, but if you knew the watershed that you were working on, you could highlight that watershed or select that watershed, search for it, and then it would adjust. Hopefully it adjusts here. It adjusts to show the Badfish Creek watershed just south of Madison. So again, another feature that might not have been readily apparent, but if you're doing work in specific watersheds, this would be one way to try and access or collect and be able to describe a little bit what information might exist on well water quality in that watershed. Some other things that I'll highlight before moving on to the next tool is just if you want a little bit of information on the data contained in this, you can go to the information button, look for, there's various kind of tabs, navigation tabs that allow you to search and see how the tool works. But there's also this about section that would basically describe the data sources. So where does this data come from? It's a combination of extension data, about 105,000 samples, DAGCAP data, DNR data for nitrate and arsenic, as well as a few health departments that have voluntarily shared their data for the purposes of this viewer. That information, if you're ever wondering, is contained in that information or that source tab. Before we go to the next tool, I would just highlight too that you are able to print maps. A lot of times I'll just do screen captures or screen grabs and save those as some sort of JPEG that I'll import into different reports or PowerPoints that I use. But if you were ever interested in a paper map or a PDF map, that is an option, is to print out the zoom and add legends and things like that. The ability to manipulate the maps is a little limited. That's probably one of the more limiting features of this tool, but that is an option to create PDFs or printouts of certain map views and map extents. So what I'm going to do now, this is the private well water data access portal that I think is probably useful to a lot of folks. I'm going to share a new tool that is not online yet, but will be available soon. And that's going to be a tool to basically describe and provide access to nitrate data from public water systems. So public water systems, if we look at the data, where this data comes from, we're looking at a combination of municipal community systems, other than municipal systems, which a lot of times, might be water systems that have 15 or more service connections, serve a community of at least 25 residents for at least 6 months of the year. So maybe it's a condo or a trailer park. Those would be typical OTM systems. And then we have things like transient non-community wells, which are going to be things like bars, restaurants, churches, campgrounds that serve transient populations. And then there's non-transient, non-community systems, things like schools, daycare centers, factories, or other businesses that are classified as a public water system and have some requirements to submit annual nitrate samples. So that's really the benefit of looking at public water systems, is that they have a greater testing history, which allows us to look at trends over time in a little bit more detail. The negative, I shouldn't say it's a negative, but the caveat looking at public water systems is that they're oftentimes probably not representative of true rural groundwater quality. They might be located in more urban areas or more densely populated areas. So we might be missing out on characterizing county level kind of groundwater quality if we were just to focus on public water systems, because they might be located in areas that aren't representative of the county necessarily, or they might be drilled with different specifications that doesn't match up with kind of shallow groundwater quality considerations sometimes. But that being said, it's an important long-term data set that will provide some insight into things like how is groundwater quality changing over time. And if it's changing, what can we learn about what's contributing to those changes? So if we look at this tool, basically it provides the ability to interact and summarize information statewide. We're looking at an individual well view, showing the average nitrate concentration for all the public water systems. And if we were to select one of those wells, it would give us information on the most recent nitrate sample, most recent sample date, as well as the maximum and minimum sample collected from this particular well, which is unique well number OQ703. There's 7 samples for that particular well, so that's describing what information is known about that well. We could also look at that information at a county level. So summarizing nitrate concentration at a county level, we could do the same thing where if we click on a county, it gives us some basic stats about the mean nitrate level and the number of wells in that particular county. I'm going to switch back to the individual well and show you some of the other functionality here. So we said there's value here in looking at trends over time. So if we look at nitrate trends, this particular view will show us which direction, if any, those wells are going. So if we look at Columbia County, if we zoom in on Columbia County, you might see a series of reddish or bluish circles, and then there's a series of gray circles. The gray would indicate wells that we determine not to have a significant change or trend. Blue wells would be wells that we determine to have a significant slight or significant decrease. And then red are slight or significant increase. And the size of that circle corresponds to kind of the magnitude of change. And people might be wondering, well, how do we know that represents a change? And if we look at this tab for individual wells, if we selected one of these, it's going to give us the unique well number. And we can actually enter that unique well number, W0016, and then it would show us that data over time for nitrate of that well. And when we fit a linear regression model to that data, it would show us that there's a significant p-value and the rate of change exceeds some threshold that we've determined to be significant. And that threshold, which we feel represents a significant trend or change, would be any well that has a p-value less than 0.05 and a rate of change greater than 1 milligram per liter over a 10-year period. And you'll see this particular rate of change would indicate 7 milligrams per liter per decade. Doesn't necessarily mean that this well is going to increase at that rate indefinitely, but over the time period for which we have a record, it does seem to indicate that things in this particular well are increasing with respect to nitrate over time. These graphics are all interactive, so if you were interested in a particular year, you could hover over it and it would tell you, what was the nitrate concentration in 2015. That data is all accessible simply by kind of hovering over some of the information contained in this graphic. The other thing to keep in mind about each individual well is most of these wells are sampled once per year. Some of them, if they're municipal systems, might be sampled monthly or quarterly. For the purposes of this particular app or tool, we've always used the maximum concentration of nitrate reported in any given year. That particular way of looking at the data allows us to separate out for treated samples in wells that submit a raw water and a treated sample. Looking at the maximum is one way to tease that information out. But it also, I think, just provides more consistency when we're looking at different systems, so that some systems don't have hundreds of samples while others might only have a few samples. So this provides a way to maybe treat wells a little bit more consistently for those wells that have more and less data. If we look at the county summary, so what we see, and let me maybe take a few more. So some people might be wondering, does that truly represent a decrease over time? And again, we could select the well YG662. And, to me, that does look like a true decrease over time. The data is only as good as the people that have collected it. And sometimes there's discrepancies or maybe there's data entry errors. So if you're ever looking through this data, you might notice some anomalies, and we're not able to explain all the anomalies, but in general, I think that the data as it's summarized here is very useful for helping county staff or local officials maybe hone in on areas or parts of the county that would be interesting to look at in more detail with respect to land use changes and how it might relate to kind of some of the changes we've seen in water systems over time. If we look at the county level summary, so county summary, and we wanted to look at, let's say, increasing trends. This particular map would show the percentage of those water systems that are increasing, and we could do the same for decreasing wells. So at the county level, what's the percentage of wells in that county with a decreasing trend? And if we clicked on the county, basically what we'd be able to see is the summary of all the wells for Marathon County. So the total number of wells, the number with significant or slight decrease, number with no change, which is probably the largest in most cases, and then the breakdown by percentage. So Portage County has 5.8% of their wells decreasing, while there's 12.4% increasing, 81.9% indicating no trend or no change. Doesn't mean that those wells don't have nitrate, it just means that the nitrate level isn't changing in a repeatable way. We can look at county level summaries if you wanted to see over time what is known about the data in individual years by county. This is providing that county level summary. So the number here is the number of wells that are included in this summary, and then box plots that allow you to see kind of the sample distribution in any given year. And those blue dots would represent the average nitrate concentration in any given year. And again, all the data is reactive, so you can hover over to see what that looks like. This dashed red line is just that 10 milligram per liter standard. So what you see is that there are a number of systems operating in Adams County currently above that 10 milligram per liter standard. The last tab is the statewide summary. So if we wanted to know how this information plays out or is aggregated at a statewide level, what we'd see is this kind of pie chart right here, indicating that the vast majority of wells aren't indicating a significant increase or decrease, but there are there are slightly more wells increasing than there are decreasing. I think the important point to point out is that it's highly variable, and that really what's happening locally around those wells is probably going to be what's most critical. Looking at summaries at the county level probably doesn't tell the whole story. If a county shows a low number of increasing wells, doesn't necessarily mean that holds true across the county, which I think is where looking at the individual wells probably is probably the most valuable kind of thing that could be gained from this particular tool. It's looking at which wells are increasing, and then specifically what's happening around those wells that might be helping to explain those changes over time. And then this shows kind of the annual statewide nitrate summary. Again, with that much data, you're not seeing much change with respect to nitrate over time, just because there's so much data that change is relatively small or not as observable as if you were to look at individual counties or individual wells. But this tool, again, I would hope that in the next couple weeks, this tool will be made available on a publicly available website, and that it could be used by people in your positions for some information. And how would you use that information or utilize it? And I think one way in which one county, and I'm going to pick on Kurt Calkins here, because Kurt contacted me a while ago asking me if I could help create kind of a template for other counties in terms of groundwater information for their groundwater management plan. So they've actually posted their most up-to-date management plan online. So you can see this section on groundwater resources contains some figures and information that they have access to because they partnered with the Geological Natural History Survey. So this nice little figure here comes from one of the reports from the Wisconsin Geological Natural History Survey. That information or that work also allowed them to create a groundwater flow, groundwater elevation map, which helps you understand groundwater flow in the county. But then here, you'll see that they were able to do screen captures and integrate some of the, let's say, nitrate data. They also integrated some of that nitrate data by looking at individual municipalities and being able to provide some summary of that information by town or village. They were able to use, or I was able to work with them to grab some of the trend data for Columbia County and allow them to integrate that into their plan for the next iteration, as well as some maps on groundwater susceptibility. Here's information that we didn't talk about that's also available on DAGCAP's website, looking at atrazine prohibition areas, which you might have or people might have in their county. So just giving you a sense for, immediately how this information might be useful to some folks on the call is if you're looking for information on integrating into your plan, these would be two tools that you could use to try and do that. This last table here is just looking at data for some of the other parameters, like chloride, conductivity, iron, manganese. Because of the extensive work Columbia County has done, they have a lot of other water chemistry data that they were able to kind of summarize for the purposes of this plan. Not all communities are going to have as many samples, but certainly you don't know unless you look. So hopefully showing these tools will encourage you or provide you with the tools to do that if necessary. So I'm going to leave it at that, Kate. I don't know if there are any questions that people have, but I'd be happy to take questions that might have come up during the presentation.
Thank you, Kevin. I don't see any questions in our chat box right now. If anybody has anything they'd like to revisit or any issues they'd like to talk to Kevin about, please type your message into the chat box and we can go through it together. Well, I see you posted your contact information, so that's another way that people could get in touch with you.
If people have questions or they're looking for more detail on any of these tools or are running into challenges using them, I'd be happy to follow up after the call as well.
Okay. We do have one attendee wondering, when will that tool be available?
When will the tool be available? We are working on getting that onto a server. I have a colleague that's trying to get that onto the server. I would imagine that within the next week or two, that public water system data would be accessible. And I will, I think the first thing I do is probably post a link on our website. I would imagine that it will trickle out and other people will link to it. But I would say within the next 2 weeks, maybe check the Center for Watershed Science and Education website, and that should be linked to it.
Okay. Let's see, Chris was looking for the Columbia County Groundwater Management Plan. I just posted a link to the version that was revised in 2016. Would that be the one that you were?
They have a more up-to-date one that covers 2021 to I think 2030.
Okay.
So it's it would be the most recent one, and I can, while we're talking here, I can try and find that link since I have it up right now.
Actually, I just found the more current one.
Okay. I mean, while we're waiting for other questions, the other point I'd like to make is that, you know, I think it is nice to use or reference resources that that people can access. So it's one thing to summarize information that you might get from an agency, but for people to be able to follow up and interact with it on their own, I think gives it a level of transparency that that we just haven't had before. So even though sometimes you might be able to make better maps in you know, in ArcGIS that are more detailed. I think having a tool that people can go to and see that, you know, the information is the same as what's written up in the report has a lot of utility. So again, I think there's ways to make prettier maps, but certainly I don't think that's always necessary.
All right, any other questions? You're getting accolades. Somebody said, thank you for developing a great tool.
Well, let's maybe hold that thanks until we get it posted online, but I'm hoping that we can follow through and get that up sooner rather than later. But thanks for that.
Okay, well, it looks like that is it. Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your work. This concludes the virtual county conservation meeting. We could only have pulled this off with the help of Extension. It took a lot of effort for us to put this together. So thanks to Rachel and the tremendous support from her colleagues at Extension. And thanks to each of you for joining us in this virtual meeting and taking time out of your schedules. We would love your feedback, so please watch for our survey in your email. And have a wonderful summer, everybody. Stay safe.